Detective Grus, who is still an active member of the police service, she was brought back on board after being suspended. Why? One can only assume because she's a super investigator and they need her to help with the caseloads.
Robert Kraychik, Ottawa, Ontario, Rebel News, at the conclusion of day 13 of the disciplinary tribunal of Constable Helen Grus. She is being accused by her employer, the Ottawa Police Service, of discreditable conduct. She was specifically determining whether or not the so-called vaccination status of mothers was at all related or connected to these infants. Now, if she is found guilty, she can be either demoted or terminated. Folks, keep in mind that in order for us to continue delivering this in-the-field journalism that no one else is going to do, obviously CTV's not here, CBC's not here. We depend on your financial support, so please help us out. Visit rebelfieldreports.com.
In my opinion, I think it's very important because I think policing has become politicized. I worked in the section that Helen worked in, and I know that you shouldn't have blinders on and particularly with infant deaths. Police have always been criticized for having blinders, and I think in this situation, because of how political the COVID narrative was, the vaccination was, and the mandates, and I think she was targeted, and I think she was penalized by management because she dared to say, no, this is wrong. And I see that here. I see that it's become incredibly political, and that's what's scary. It's very scary. The police do not appear to be impartial these days. That's what I'm seeing.
I got one last question for you, just because you've got so much tenure and seniority here, or experience. You must have had conversations with colleagues about these subjects, right? Obviously, you're interested in this. Have you heard this from colleagues of yours? Without naming names, have you met professionals in law enforcement who also share these concerns?
Yes.
Yeah, like you're not alone.
Yes, I would say that. Yes, I have. And what also is alarming is that I see also a lot of colleagues who don't want to see that this is happening either. That they just automatically assume because somebody is a police officer that they're doing the right thing.
Today's proceedings saw a continuation of an ongoing theme, a trend that we've observed across this entire tribunal: the reflexive refusal from the prosecution to allow for the admission as exhibits any Ottawa Police Service documents. Now, clearly, Helen Grus, her defense team, wishes to enter as exhibits certain OPS documents that they determine to be apropos, germane, relevant to their defense. So every time a document is sought to be entered into the proceedings as an exhibit, you get this reflexive objection. Now, Chris Renwick, who is the hearing officer, the de facto judge overseeing these proceedings, the trier of fact, if you will, has almost always agreed with the prosecution and sustained their reflexive refusal to allow these documents to be admitted as exhibits. And the claim from the prosecutor, Vanessa Stewart, in this instance, is that her client, the OPS, has not given permission for these documents to be entered into the proceedings as exhibits, and therefore open to the public record. Now, I'll give you some examples of what these policy documents include. A job description. Also, perhaps the policies that Helen Grus herself is accused to have violated. Now, consider that for a moment. The very policies that she is accused of violating are not allowed to be entered into the proceedings as exhibits. So, Bathsheba Vandenberg, one of Helen Grus's lawyers, asked almost rhetorically, how are we supposed to defend our client if we cannot get access to the OPS documents that are relevant to our defense?
I would say throughout it's been a failure for the OPS to disclose what the defense believes is pertinent evidence for their client, Detective Grus, to defend herself in this discreditable conduct hearing began with third-party records. We're talking about the autopsy reports. That was disallowed. I mean, these are autopsy reports that could confirm Detective Grus's suspicion that the vaccine was, in fact, a factor in some of the infant deaths that she was investigating. And perhaps the most egregious piece of evidence that was disallowed was Detective Grus's duty book. It was her final duty book. It has one entry for January 30th, 2022, which was her last day.
Right.
Why is this key? Because on that day, she called the father of a deceased infant to determine the vaccine status of the mother. During testimony, Sergeant Arbuthnot of Professional Standards Unit testified that he read only one duty book. Well, in fact, there are two duty books, the second of which, with the January 30th entry, the day Detective Grus telephoned the family of this deceased infant. Well, we're not allowed to see this. Detective Grus isn't allowed to see it. Her defense isn't allowed to see it. Detective Grus, who is still an active member of the police service, she was brought back on board after being suspended. Why? One can only assume because she's a super investigator and they need her to help with the caseloads. Now she's being denied access to similar OPS documents. I mean, we're not talking about, third-party documents that would reveal sensitive information about criminals, about victims, or sort of accused people. We're talking about just policy documents, right? Documents that, I mean, if you looked on the internet, you might be able to come up with some of these documents. Type in police services board meetings, right? Some of these documents are contained in appendices for these meetings that you can find online.
We also saw more testimony today from Peter Daniluk. He is a retired Ottawa Police Service officer. He worked with the OPS for over 20 years and did over 10 years in the military. And he was invited to testify as a witness for the defense. He said that Helen Grus's inquiry into this possible link between the so-called COVID-19 vaccines and the rise in infant deaths that were seen after these so-called vaccines were released was reasonable. He used that language, reasonable. He also speculated that some of Helen Grus's colleagues inside the sexual assault and child abuse unit were uncomfortable with her speculations about the so-called vaccines, that they were neither safe nor effective, and as such had a grievance with her and submitted reports against her to the Professional Standards Unit, the PSU, which engaged in an investigation of Grus, and which is what brought us here today. This is what launched these accusations and this tribunal. Blair Ector, another of Helen Grus's lawyers, shared what he described as a bombshell towards the end of today's proceedings. He said that an email was sent to his client, Helen Grus, several hours earlier from Hugh O'Toole, who heads the Ottawa Police Service's Professional Standards Unit. Again, the PSU is the unit that operates as a sort of internal affairs enforcement division of the OPS. And the PSU is responsible for bringing these allegations against Helen Grus. Now, what did O'Toole state to Grus in this email? He advised her in the email that she is not permitted to use any OPS documents in her expected testimony. It didn't happen today, but Helen Grus is expected to testify during tomorrow's proceedings. Now, Ector described this as intimidating his witness and tampering with the events of the proceedings. He also told Chris Renwick that he wants to invite O'Toole to testify, and he wants to question O'Toole as a hostile witness. So we'll see how that plays out tomorrow. Dear Rebel News audience, please remember that we depend on your financial support to produce this in-the-field journalism. So please help us out and visit rebelfieldreports.com.